Okay, relationships. They can be kind of tricky, right? Like trying to solve a puzzle, but blindfold.
Yeah, definitely.
So today we're diving deep into this whole thing, expectations, boundaries, all that good stuff in relationships. We've got this guide we're using called Expectations and Boundaries.
It's really interesting, how these concepts can actually like make or break a relationship,
Yeah.
even though they seem kind of basic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this book, it goes really deep and it even gets into like some psychology and sociology, which is really cool to help us really get it.
Yeah, it's like those aha moments. You realize things from your past, like even how you grew up, can affect how you are in relationships without you even realizing it.
Okay, let's start with expectations. I think we all come into relationships with ideas about how things should be, don't we?
Totally. Expectations and boundaries talks about this, like all those unspoken assumptions you have about how your partner should act, or what you think you should get from the relationship.
It can really set you up for success or like total disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's say, for example, my expectation is that my partner will always call to say goodnight,
Okay.
but they like prefer to text goodnight.
Mm.
Is that setting myself up for disappointment?
Yeah, definitely. It could be. And it might seem like a small thing, but when you have a lot of these little mismatched expectations, it can add up
Yeah.
and lead to feeling like, let down or like your partner's not on the same page.
Right, right. So it's not just about the expectations themselves, but how you uh, talk about them
Exactly.
and find some kind of like common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where like understanding psychology can be really helpful. The book talks about attachment theory, which basically says that your experiences as a kid, with your parents or caregivers, that kind of shapes how you are in relationships later in life.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So like if someone had a parent who wasn't really there for them emotionally, they might grow up expecting their partners to be kind of distant too.
Yeah, that's one possibility. Or someone who has like an anxious attachment style, they might need a lot of reassurance from their partner, which can be too much for the other person.
So we really do bring our past into our relationships.
Huh. To some degree, yeah, we all do. But being aware of these patterns can help you understand like why you have the expectations you have.
Yeah, yeah.
And if they're, realistic or healthy for the relationship.
Expectations and boundaries mention social exchange theory too, right?
It does, yeah.
What's that about?
Basically, we're all like subconsciously weighing the costs and benefits in our relationships.
Okay.
So if you feel like you're always giving more or your needs aren't being met, it gets out of balance.
Like when you're the one who's always planning things or
Yeah.
making the effort.
Exactly. And that can lead to feeling resentful, like you're not getting a fair deal.
Wow. It's like my desire for fairness could actually hurt my relationships. Okay. Let's talk about boundaries. I kind of think of them like those invisible fences,
Yeah.
To protect yourself.
That's a great analogy. And the book really emphasizes that boundaries aren't about being selfish.
Yeah.
It's about creating a safe space
Yeah.
for both partners.
Right. So both people can be themselves and have their needs respected.
Exactly. It gives the example of needing time alone after work to unwind before having like a serious conversation.
Yeah, I get that. Like my partner's a night owl and I wake up early. We had to set some boundaries around sleep to make sure we're both getting enough rest.
That's a great example of how boundaries can actually help the relationship, not hurt it.
Expectations and boundaries also talks about how society, like our culture, influences boundaries, right?
Yeah.
It mentions this thing called symbolic interactionism.
Yeah. Basically, we learn how to interact and set boundaries based on the people around us and the culture we're in. Like, think about how different cultures have different ideas about showing affection in public
Oh, yeah.
for personal space.
Right. What's normal in one culture could be like way too much in another.
Right. Totally. And these social norms change all the time, so it's important to think about how they might be affecting your expectations and boundaries in your relationships.
It's like there are all these hidden things that shape how we relate to each other.
Yeah. And the book reminds us that being aware of those things is the first step to having healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
Okay, before we get into hard lines and deal breakers, what happens when boundaries get blurry? The book talks about enmeshment. What's that?
Enmeshment. It's when people in a relationship get so close they lose their sense of self.
Okay.
Like two trees growing so close together you can't tell their branches apart. It might sound romantic, but it can be bad for both people.
So how does that connect to boundaries or not having them?
Well, enmeshment often happens when there aren't clear boundaries. It can lead to things like codependency, where one person feels like they're responsible for the other person's happiness,
Okay.
or like not having enough independence, where someone feels stifled and can't do their own thing.
So it's not about like putting up walls, but
Yeah.
creating a healthy space.
Yes, exactly. Think of boundaries as guidelines for being close in a healthy way, not in a way that smothers each other.
I'm really liking this topic.
Mhm.
It's making me see boundaries in a whole new light. They aren't about pushing people away. It's more like making an environment where both people can really thrive.
Totally. Boundaries are self-care that ends up helping the relationship.
Okay, let's get into the non-negotiables. Those hard lines in a relationship.
Hard lines, those are like your core values, the things you won't budge on in a relationship. Expectations and boundaries makes that really clear. These aren't things you're willing to negotiate.
So they're different from boundaries. Because with boundaries, there's a little wiggle room, right?
Yeah, exactly. Boundaries can kind of change as you go, as the relationship grows, but hard lines, those are the things that don't change.
Like, what would be a good example? The book talks about infidelity, but what are some others?
Hmm. It really depends on the person, but it could be like being totally against lying, or a commitment to staying sober, or maybe a strong belief in managing money together,
Yeah.
sharing finances.
Right, right. It's like those values that make you who you are. And if those lines get crossed, it's like a betrayal, like to yourself almost.
Exactly. The book even says that if you ignore or compromise on those hard lines, you can end up with a lot of inner conflict, and it can damage your self-worth.
It's like if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. You got to have a strong base.
Yeah, I like that. And when you're clear about your hard lines, it helps you find partners who are on the same page, values-wise.
So it's not about being controlling, it's about being true to yourself.
Hmm.
And that way you can build a relationship on respect and understanding.
Absolutely. And speaking of respect and understanding, let's talk about deal breakers. Those are the things in a partner that would make a relationship impossible, right?
Right. It's like you might really like someone, but then there's this one thing, this big red flag,
Right.
and you're like, nope, this just won't work.
Yeah. The book really stresses that you have to recognize your deal breakers and stick to them no matter how tempting it might be to ignore them, especially, when you're first starting out with someone.
What are some common deal breakers? I know it's different for everyone, but are there any examples in the book?
Well, it could be anything, like a lack of ambition, not wanting to grow as a person, controlling behavior, addiction problems, or even clashing beliefs about family, religion, lifestyle stuff.
It's so interesting how different deal breakers are for different people. What might be a total turnoff for one person, someone else might not even care.
That's why knowing yourself is so important. What are you really looking for in a partner? The book says that if you ignore your deal breakers, you can waste a lot of time and end up getting hurt.
It's like you might settle for a relationship that doesn't really make you happy because you're scared of being alone. Or you try to make something work that just isn't right.
Right. And remember that social exchange theory we were talking about. That applies here too. If the bad stuff about being with someone, their deal breaker behavior outweighs the good stuff, the relationship probably won't last.
So even if there's a lot of attraction in the beginning, if those deal breakers keep coming up, it's probably a sign that it's not a good match for the long run.
Exactly. It's about seeing those warning signs and being brave enough to walk away, even when it's tough.
I'm starting to see the whole picture now.
Yeah.
Expectations are like what we hope for. Boundaries protect our space. Hard lines are our core values. And deal breakers are like the big alarms going off.
Expectations and boundaries does a great job of showing how all these pieces fit together to create a healthy and happy relationship.
So it's not just about avoiding arguments or finding someone who's exactly like us. It's more about creating a space where both people feel respected, supported, and free to be themselves.
That's it. And the book has some really good practical advice on how to actually do all of this.
What are some of the biggest takeaways you found?
Yeah, there are a lot of good ones. I think the most important thing is like building healthy relationships. It's a process. It's not, you don't just like get there and that's it. It's something you keep working on with your partner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. It's about showing up and communicating and growing together.
And it's okay to ask for help, right?
Mhm.
Like from friends, family, a therapist.
Absolutely. Expectations and boundaries talks about that too. Having support can make a big difference.
Sometimes you need that outside view, especially when things are tough.
For sure. And the book has some really good resources if you want to go deeper into all this.
Yeah, let's talk about those. What are some that stood out to you?
Okay, well, if you're interested in those early childhood influences, there's this book, A Secure Base by Bowlby. It's a classic for understanding attachment styles and how they affect your relationships.
Ooh, adding that to my list.
And if you want some practical advice on how to communicate better and make your relationship stronger, there's The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work by Gottman. It's got a ton of great tips based on research.
I've heard great things about that one. What about for setting boundaries, like really good boundaries?
There's a book called Boundaries: When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life by Cloud and Townsend. It's really helpful for setting boundaries in all parts of your life, not just relationships.
Awesome. Okay, so many good books to check out. Any other final thoughts from expectations and boundaries before we wrap up?
I think the last big takeaway is that relationships, they really reflect what's going on inside us. The more you understand yourself, your needs, your values, the better your relationships will be.
So true. It's about becoming the best version of yourself, and then you can create those healthy connections.
Exactly. And expectations and boundaries gives you the tools to do just that.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into expectations and boundaries. So much great stuff.
It was fun exploring these ideas with you.
Before we go, I want to leave you with this. Take some time to think about your own relationships. What expectations do you have? What boundaries could be stronger? And what are those absolute deal breakers, the things you just can't compromise on?
It's a good way to get to know yourself better and build stronger relationships.
That's all for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep those relationships